Great, great.
Okay, maybe a bit of introduction from me.
Sure, sure.
Sure. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Dewi Arum Nawangwungu. Simply call me Arum. Mbak Arum, Bu Arum, up to you. And I'm going to be your moderator for today. To those who are wondering who I am, well, let me use this opportunity to let you know that I'm also your new lecturer in the Department of Political Science. So I can wait to cooperate and collaborate soon with all of you. Okay, welcome to today's 3-in-1 class session with Professor Dr. Bulbul Dar James. The main theme is still about global political economy and governance. Hello, good afternoon, Professor. We are very happy to see you again. About 2 weeks ago, in our first session, Professor James had talked thoroughly about the concepts and perspectives, state and market relations and globalizations. And thanks to her great explanations and examples, we can understand better how the interrelationships among individuals, the market, governments, and public policy work. Today, we hope to get another knowledge from Professor James about three main perspectives of the global political economy. And also just a little housekeeping, I guess, before we get started. If you have any question during the presentation, please write them down. First on your notes, your books, or your phone. We will have Q&A session later after Professor James finished her explanations. And I will let 2 to 3 questions from you. And please take note if we encounter some trouble with our internet connection, kindly bear with us, okay? Thank you. To Professor James, I invite you to start the material.
So I hope you've received the handouts of the last session that we did. And also some readings. I'm going to put some more readings down as I do the particular topics. I'm going to put the readings accordingly, but a lot of the readings are overarching. So do look at that. I'm just going to put this forth for you very quickly. So today I'm doing the next bit and I've put a little prelude to what we did earlier. And what we covered in the previous was concepts and perspectives of placing the political and economic in perspective. Because when we talk about political economy, Habibi, am I going slow enough today instead of rushing through? So it's important for us to understand that this is not a new discipline. It's just that we are looking at it from a new perspective. So we've had, as I told you the last time, we've had political economy, which was the nomenclature of the discipline of political science and economics before it became bifurcated into the two. And so there's always been this connect that we would look at. The last time we looked at the concept of the market in terms of it being a market with myriad dimensions to it, whether it is in terms of buying and selling goods, buying and selling services, buying and selling ideas, deciding on what is the right time, place, what is the cost, what is the price that you'll pay. And now with so much of IT and globalization, the promotional techniques that would be applied, because that's going to make, you know, that Elon Musk yesterday Musk has actually bought Twitter. So, you know, how things change. Social media has become such a significant area, which might be, you know, changing the complexion of things in a major way. So we are looking at artificial intelligence and others. And we also did it in terms of the parallel existence of the state and the market relation, which is a causal relationship. One works towards the other. And this we put in the perspective of the post-colonial state, which had a development model, which was a state-managed development model, where the state is seen as a rational actor for the benefit of the entire society. And with state intervention in all dimensions in a post-colonial state, there was an element of socialism and a consensus on socialism, because the realization was that socialism was legitimate. And this made way, and when I say made way, I want to emphasize here the TINA factor, or TINA as in there was no alternative, there is no alternative. And since there was no alternative, they had to apply, and this is what I'm going to do in the next session with you when I do the financial institutions, had to apply the dictates to get any loan from the IMF and World Bank, had to apply those dictates in terms of economic and related political, social, and other aspects of liberalization, but essentially economic liberalization. So there is a TINA factor, what I've written, which is there is no alternative, because of which this was needed. The donor conditionality of any of the international agencies through which we were taking the loan became contingent upon the IMF and the World Bank rules, IMF and the World Bank strings that were attached, IMF and the World Bank conditions which were there were met by the individual countries or not. So we had short-term stabilization measures and long-term SAP, what I've written here, was structural adjustment programs. Now, structural adjustment programs were not simple because they came with strings attached. They had certain implications, which meant that the economies, in fact, the societies of these countries were completely going to be rehauled. Simultaneous to economic liberalization was globalization, which, as we did last time, it's a malleable catch-all term, but it's not new. And we also mentioned that Marx spoke about globalization of capital ages back, and that's a little bit I'm going to look at here today. So it's not new, it's just that the complexion of globalization is new. The technology endemic within it, the irreversible element within it, and predominance of all these aspects of the market that we are speaking about predominates in a globalized era, where marketization becomes equivalent to almost globalization. And then we look at global governance, and we ended the last lecture with balancing the relative strengths of the state, civil society, and market, which is the triad, which is the political, social, and the economic dimension. The state remains, the political remains on the top, but maneuvered at the base by civil society initiatives and the market compulsions, if you like. So we are looking at globalization having led to liberalization and privatization. So when we say the economies of the world are being globalized, they're simultaneously being liberalized as well. So we're looking at a scenario where we are looking at economic liberalization being specific to these countries which have taken loan, and which means the entire of the Southern Hemisphere and so much more. And the conditions of the loan are so stringent that you have to apply this in terms of the change in your entire infrastructural microeconomic system of the countries at large. And this is not uniform. This involves, and the idea behind it, why are they pushing for these reforms? Why are they pushing for it to give us loan? Because the idea being that the economy has to become profitable for business. In other words, IMF and World Bank say that if we are giving you this loan, we don't want to put it in a bottomless pit. We do want it back, and with interest. We are not an altruistic agency. We are not a grant-making body. We are giving you a loan which we want returned. So they are practically seeking a policy of the state retreating voluntarily. State retreating voluntarily in favor of the private sector, which means the statal sector, the parastatal sector, all of which existed has to be changed, and that complexion has to come through a newer kind of a format now. So we are looking at liberalization, privatization, globalization, or LPG, in terms of the increased global interconnectedness, which is happening because of globalization. This is not a mandate of the TINA factor of the IMF and World Bank. It is a backlash effect of globalization generally, where the interconnectedness has become so much more. So there's an increase in the global interconnectedness that has meant a decrease in the policy instruments available to the states, to the individual nation states, to control activities within and beyond their borders. So it's not an easy option. International forms of collaboration have increased, as has political integration with other states. So with the kind of loans that most countries have taken from IMF, World Bank, and the movement from GATT to WTO, which is what we're going to do the next time, has meant a kind of a global governance being brought into being at the detriment of, and this is really trying to achieve, an increased pace of privatization or the private sector in these countries. And all of this means, to put this in context, all of this means, this reform process means that the conditionality becomes central to the development that is taking place. It's not something that the countries or we are seeking ourselves and trying to achieve. What it does to the political framework is something that we need to, put in perspective, very deeply in perspective, because the governments of these countries, to undertake the kind of contradictory reforms that the IMF and World Bank are stating, have to destabilize their own, what is called the vote bank. And because it's not easy to close down sectors, to do away with jobs, to create a private sector in a separate situation, to break down your social welfare system, which is what it has entailed, which is where the political and economic, kind of is working on the social, which is the civil society. And these multiple pressures are destabilizing, politically destabilizing the states as well. Now, it's been 30 years since, and World Bank and IMF's assumption in these reforms is that when applied to developing countries, economic growth, and this is something they stressed, can only be, met if the state gets contracted, or the state activity, the state sector, the parastatal sector gets contracted, and a liberalized market comes into being. Now, liberalized market is a key kind of an aspect that we need to look at. So in many senses, the international financial institution, whether it's the World Bank, whether it's the IMF, or others that we are looking at, including WTO, and the changes in terms of trade and how it's impacted environment come into being. We need to look at that, because today we cannot talk about development simply as economic growth. We have to look at development as sustainable development, and sustainable development entails natural resources, entails the environment being preserved, entails basically, as the Bluntern Commission reports, a definition is maintaining intergenerational equity, which means having enough resources, natural resources at our disposal, and using them, astutely, not misusing them, so that the next generation have access to those resources as well, which is something that we really need to bring as part of our own psyche. So, you had Mahatma Gandhi at that point had said that there is enough for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. And that's the kind of notion we need to look at, that the greed that liberalization increases with the choices that it brings in, and the market which is open and accessibility for those who can afford it, becomes something that we need to distinguish between the need and the greed, or the need and luxury, if you like, because they could be inconsequential choices that we are looking at. So today's session, basically we had to look at the perspectives, and historically broad ideologies or perspectives on political economy could be there. We are calling them ideologies in a sense, because of the fact that even though political scientists differ on the nature of the relationship between economic and political affairs, many positions can be identified, but almost every position tends to fall under one or two of these perspectives. So it's not as if these are the only ones, and I would like to do, if I have the time this time, but hopefully next time, or probably when we connect the empirical with the conceptual, on other notions which would fall in. But today I want to do a broad overview of these three perspectives in which all other contrasting perspectives fall, which is nationalism, liberalism, and Marxism. And the conflict, as very often understood, the conflict among these three is the moral kind of intellectual position that one can hold, and in the context of the market. So market, when we are looking at political economy, market remains central to all of these. So what is the perspective on market of the liberals, of the economic nationalists, or of the Marxists becomes significant? What place does it hold? And we are still looking at that triad of the state at the top with market and civil society at the bottom, that triangular thing that we want to, kind of emphasize on. That becomes significant. Why ideology? We are saying these are ideological perspectives. And what is ideology? Ideology is a form of social or political philosophy in which practical elements are as prominent as the theoretical ones. So it is basically a system of ideas that aspires to explain the world. It's a world view. But alongside, it also aspires to change that if there's an idea there. So when the liberals are talking about, liberalism is talking about political economy, the whole idea is that they would want to change that in some senses as well towards their angle, and so would the other dimensions. So the three ideologies differ in their conception of the relationship amongst the state, society, and the market. And it's something that, it would not be an exaggeration to state that every controversy in the field of international political economy is ultimately reducible to the relationships that we are talking about, that is the state, civil society, and the market. So the intellectual clash can be in other ways, but economic liberalism, Marxism, economic nationalism are very much alive at the end of the day. So that remains central, and we're still talking about ideology. And Heilbronner's definition is something that Gilpin picks up, and I've shared the book with you, where ideology is a system of thought and beliefs in which individuals and groups understand what the principles the society exemplifies and what the society's operational domain is. So the idea is to actually explain it. Like, I don't know if you've done Kuhn, paradigm of Kuhn and Popper debate. I'm not sure you've done, but we don't want to go too in depth in it. I suspect this is a bachelor's level class, so we will, kind of stick to the basics here. And I do want you to understand it, but essentially, when we are talking about ideology, we are talking about, and Gilpin is talking about it, because each position, he points out, entails a whole belief system concerning the nature of the human being and society, which he says is very similar to what Thomas Kuhn spoke about of a paradigm, and what is a paradigm, and what was he really speaking about? How the world does its work was the kind of paradigm that would be there, or how the world should do the work. So there's an ought to aspect there also when we look at these conceptualizations. And Gilpin believes in liberalism himself, and he stated that as much. He says, I don't agree with the other ideologies. He iterates that the world we live in is best described by, he says, despite believing in liberalism, the world we live in is best described by ideas of economic nationalism and occasionally those of Marxism. And this is, I'm quoting straight from him. So, as I said earlier, relevant in all of these perspectives is, of course, the relationship between or amongst the state, society, and the market in all three perspectives that we are going to do today. It remains central. So the three ideologies differ on the range of questions, which is, differing in terms of the significance of the market for economic growth and distribution of wealth among groups and societies. What is the role of the market? Again, the three ideologies would be different in the organization of the domestic and the international society. What is the effect of market on the issue of war and peace? And we are seeing how in this, we are seeing live examples of political economy at work with, the Ukraine war and the entire NATO focus versus the whole notion of who's going to buy, products from Russia. And despite all the focus and ideologies in place, they have no other, perhaps the TINA factor operates there as well. They have no other alternative but to buy from Russia. You have Germany and others who ostensibly are standing with NATO are still doing it. Others are even doing it furtively. Things are coming out. I mean, India has been open about that and says that, our national interest is that we buy those products and it doesn't, really hold good in any other way. But in all of these three perspectives that we do, keep in mind that all three are looking at the significance of the market. All three are looking at these questions, but from different perspectives. One, the significance of the market. Two, market for economic growth and distribution of wealth among groups and societies. Liberalism, of course, doesn't believe in distribution in an equal way. Nationalism would look at state as the central perspective. The role of the market in the organization of this entire domestic and international society becomes significant, and the effect of the market system. And today, more than any time else, it's so much more predominant. So the first one, if we look at, is the nationalist. If we look at the nationalist perspective, which is also the economic nationalism per se, it's basically, in oversimplified terms, the nationalist perspective is in terms of economic nationalism, or what was originally called mercantilism. So developed from the early modern period, in historically, it assumes, in fact, indeed, it advocates the primacy of politics over economics. So it's essentially a doctrine of state building, and in a sense, asserts that markets should be subordinate to the pursuit of the state interest, of the national interest of the state. That is, political factors should determine national interest. Clearly, they are saying. They are clearly saying that politics has primacy over economics, and there is nothing you can, push for if that change doesn't come from the country or the state, the nation state itself. And this nationalist, economic nationalism has metamorphosed over the years. It has different dimensions, different colors and hues, but broadly from mercantilism to statism, which means excessive state, to protectionism, that you will protect your own interest. I want to point here that with economic liberalization in place, not economic liberalism, but economic liberalization in place, and globalization along with it, and privatization, or in other words, LPG, it is not easy to have protectionism as one's, you can put that on paper, but it is not an operational dimension. So we really need to look at this from the perspective of how economic nationalism has changed. And the central idea, of course, remains the primacy of the state here, the military power, the national security in the organization and functioning of the international system, and so on and so forth. Basically, two postulates of nationalism, can be kind of pointed out. And Gilpin has distinguished these as benign mercantilism and malevolent mercantilism. And the benign mercantilism is really safeguarding the interests of the national economic interests as the minimum essential for security and survival of the state. And the idea being that you do the basic minimum here. There are others within this framework, because remember, we are categorizing into these ideologies or perspectives in retrospect after the people have done work on it. And it's been, so we are categorizing certain thinking and worldviews into these three perspectives, if you like. There are others within this perspective who regard the international economy as an arena for imperialist expansion and national aggrandizement. That is an aggressive form, that for your national interests, you're going to fight wars. So Russia could come under this category today when it's talking about it, that NATO has come to our doorstep. We didn't have a choice. So we had to break down this. And also there's this intrusion of NATO into our own country. And it's not new. I mean, Russia was very clear that this is not something which is new. It is something which is being propagated in a way over the years, and there have been enough warnings. And you've had, functionaries within the American system who have acknowledged the fact that Putin had declared this long back, that if NATO doesn't back off, he's going to go in for war. But it wasn't taken seriously. So this is this aggressive form, which national interest takes in some senses, which we can see in place here. So the liberal writers view pursuit of power and wealth as a choice between guns and butter, as involving a trade-off. Nationalists here tend to regard the two goals as being complementary, both guns and butter being complementary, that you need to have an overall system, your state system, which needs to be safeguarded, yet you need to provide for your own people within that larger system. So within this framework, every conflict is both economic and political. And, because economic nationalism or nationalism is a very old kind of a system, and they're both countering, all these three are countering each other. They also grow in response to it. They also backtrack in response to each other. So 52, you had Haughey, who spoke about it as a conflict, both economic and political. Roberts, who later in 56 spoke about military revolutions as part of, the state being consolidated. Then Sen by the 80s spoke about industrialization being significant if you wanted to make your state, economically sound and stable. Alexander Hamilton, in the American perspective, spoke about manufacturing sector, majorly prosperity of the manufacturing sector. So all dimensions of state interest from different ways. Some have emphasized some political scientists and philosophers have kind of emphasized some areas, others have emphasized others. All of these, plus the dependency theorists also, who said that we want to get out of this dependency in a post-colonial way. So you had Samir Amin, you had Hamza Alvi, you had a whole lot of arena where the emphasis was on national self-sufficiency rather than economic interdependence. They said that you needed to create that. So there were a lot of buyers, there were a lot of takers for this kind of a premise of, if you like, economic nationalism in a lot of ways. Now, remember, all these are simultaneously happening, being preceded by. So you had really the development of liberalism, and there's a dispute whether liberalism can really be a liberal theory of political economy at all, because liberalism separates economics from politics, and it assumes that each sphere operates according to particular rules and logic of its own. So people have actually questioned, how can liberalism be an ideology within it? But when we look at the kind of thinking and perspectives that developed, liberalism becomes very, very central to it. So, and you have, you start from the laissez-faire liberalism, which is freedom in trade, free trade as laissez-faire was, which in retrospect we call negative liberalism, to a welfare statist positive liberalism later. So it's developed in Western Europe, USA, and embodied in the discipline of economics itself. When you talk about laissez-faire or you're talking about free trade, it's clearly focused on the fact that you needed to have the freedom to be able to operate. So stuff like private property, private ownership was part of the thinking that liberalism was trying to propagate. All of these are ideas that are there, and then they also propagate what should be there. So, so Adam Smith and liberal thinkers like that actually propagated and shared certain beliefs about human nature, about society, about the kind of economic activities, which needed to be there. You have Adam Smith, the debate, on state and market is, in fact, as old as Adam Smith, who called the market, the invisible hand there. The role of the state market and civil society has been changing in this perspective there and then. So various ideas have been propagated by different schools of thought. So you would have others, and we're going to do a little bit after this, we'll do Marxism as well. But the commitment to that liberalism had to individualism, to free trade, to private property is something which is a constant that we are going to look at. So you have present day liberal economists believe in progress, defined most frequently as increase in your personal wealth per capita. You have differing streams, a lot of differences, but they're still part of the liberal tradition. Even the liberal tradition is so complex and so conflictual sometimes when we're talking about laissez-faire and simultaneously talking about a welfare state. We're talking about stuff that there's a continuum in that regard, yet there's an element of differentiation. So you have, Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman with different, despite significant differences in their political and theoretical views, they are regarded as, representatives of the liberal tradition, American liberal tradition, and the American liberal tradition is fairly predominant in propagating the idea of all, free market, private property, individualism in an open way. It's a different thing that today countries, for instance, like India, China, definitely, which was ostensibly People's Republic, India, which, even now in its preamble of the constitution is socialist, are out and out, towards individualistic free market and private property kind of a scenario that we are, actually in operational terms applying. So liberal economic and political theory, there's a liberal economic theory which is committed to free market and minimal state intervention, but the extent of this can vary. So it's not defined as, completely. Both remain, flexible. So commitment to free market and minimal state intervention. The commitment to free market could be in percentage terms less than the state intervention that is there, or vice versa. So the extent varies accordingly in terms of the economic theory that liberalism propagates. Liberal political theory, on the other hand, is committed to individual equality and liberty. Here again, the extent to which, this change will be there, the extent, the percentages through which it's going to be propagated is also subjective. So we are looking at a kind of a vacillating stance on how that change is going to be, how it's being perceived. And in general terms, uh, uh, in absolute terms, if we talk about it, everyone, it's important to emphasize that although everyone will or at least be better off, and this is something, one has to emphasize here, that at least everyone will be at least better off in absolute terms under free exchange. The relative gains, when we look at both of these, are going to be different. And it's this kind of differentiation or a critique or a problematic of the liberal concept, as you saw in the nationalist, economic nationalist concept. There are changes that one needs to understand in a lot of ways. Similarly, here that lies its own critiquing that we are looking at. So liberalism in that sense, and this is something at a general level we need to put in perspective, how this whole assumption, the pattern that liberalism is speaking about, is constantly reiterating and defining a doctrine of market economy. So, I mean, it's been propagating that right from the beginning, right from laissez-faire onwards. And the idea was of freedom, the fact of freedom. The idea was of choices. And if we look at the political economy dimension, where liberal theory can be perceived, it is basically managing the market economy, managing this market economy to achieve, maximum efficiency. It says that you need to maximize on that efficiency. The cost of that maximization is not, considered, because that cost of maximizing efficiency could be killing the initiative, could be in other ways. So each of these, conceptual parts of the three perspectives that we are looking at have themselves got a critique within it. Individual welfare, when we are speaking about, we are talking about individual welfare, yet no concept of social welfare being brought in. Or if the social welfare is there, it is, in terms of achieving good as much as possible without detrimental impact on, say, the capitalists at large, because the incentives need to be maintained. And this is something they have learned from Marxism, and the failure of Marxism, if you like, that it really needs to be maintained. Economic growth is central to liberalism. I mean, that remains. But today, when we look at it beyond Gilpin, today, when we look at it, we have to see liberalism propagating sustainable development, not just pure economic growth. It's something that we need to put in perspective in a major way. So the liberal assumption is that market exists where individuals have complete information and are equipped to, quote unquote, choose the most beneficial course of action. The assumption of the liberals is also that individual producers and consumers are responsive to price signals. So it would be defined in terms of how much can be paid for particular commodities or services. Services has become a very, very significant thing. And now you can see how the proportional element has come in a big way. The fact that social media is being treated like a commodity, which is influencing others and able to make changes in so many ways. So somewhere, you have the whole notion of individual initiative, along with, the fact of not delimiting the freedom that the state has for trade and other perspectives. So, so it's also a flexible economy in which change in relative prices will lead to a corresponding change in pattern of production, in the pattern of consumption, in the kind of economic institutions that would, come up. And in fact, a point that is being made is that the economic institutions are the product rather than the cause of economic behavior. They lead the pattern of production and consumption leads to certain economic institutions. The economic institutions don't create the pattern of production and consumption. It's not reverse. And this is also because what are we at in terms of, dealing with the change that needs to come in here. So somewhere along the line, when we talk about the liberal assumption, there is an element of, change which is sought in a lot of ways. And this is when, we have liberalism being talking about equilibrium and stability because of the market economy, but in real terms, all of these, which could be the positives of liberalism, which define liberalism, all of these could actually be problematic because the equilibrium that is manifestly seen is not all that sound. And what is regarded as inherent stability over a long period of time is at many, many costs. So if a cost-benefit analysis is done, that's where the problem comes in. So the fact that the government should not intervene in the market except when there's a market failure is something that liberalism propagates, or in order to provide the so-called public or the private good, which Olson has pointed out in early 1965, the government should intervene. So the government intervention is sought to be minimized completely. And market economy is something that out and out liberals are, propagating in a big way. Under this kind of a free exchange, the society will be more wealthy. That's the whole idea behind the liberals. And individuals will be rewarded in terms of their marginal productivity and their relative contribution to the overall social product. So you're going to be rewarded according to what you do. And this is very antithetical to the Marxist, which when we do later, which of course Marxist is also not one uniform homogeneous bag of ideologies. There are differentiations there as well. But having said that, the whole concept of Marxism, to each according to his need and from each according to his ability, is completely overturned by the liberals here. When they speak about, the individual reward would be in terms of the marginal productivity and their relative contribution to the social product there. It would not be according to the need of the person. In fact, need is not considered at all. If you can afford to, you buy. If you can't afford to, you do not, kind of multiply your needs. And hence, a lot of which is constantly, being propagated in other ways when the needs get expanded. So critiquing liberalism, it's important to emphasize that although everyone will be better off, or at least can benefit from it. And it is because of this, these relative gains and distribution of wealth, which is generated by the market system, that you had liberalism being critiqued and simultaneously giving rise to economic nationalism and Marxism. in reaction as rival doctrines. This is something which emerged, in ways in which you couldn't really, put this, how would you gauge what the change would need to be? And we saw in economic nationalism how national interest or the state-centric approaches were becoming significant. And we'll see in Marxism, which we are going to do next year, how that whole concept of, the whole Marxist perspective is looking at a notion of development, which is very, very different from the liberal one. So, and Marxist perspective is, of course, being drawn from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. But there are strands within Marxism, and basically broadly two strands if we look at in terms of the social democrats, Edward Bernstein, Karl Kautsky, and other extreme ones, the revolution, and along with, revolutionary Marxist of Lenin, which was practiced in Russia too. And of course, then you have early Marx speaking about alienation and other dimensions, which doesn't come in political economy when we, speak about it at large. And later Marx was speaking about equality per se and the change that needs to be brought in. So broadly, Marxist elements, 4 elements of Marxist writings, especially in terms of looking at political economy, would be the methodology or the dialectical approach to knowledge, which, they have constantly propagated. Secondly, and this dialectical approach to knowledge and society that defines the nature of reality, as being dynamic and conflictual. So social equilibrium and consequent change are due to the class struggle, is what Marx, kind of points out. And the working out of contradictions is inherent in the social and political phenomena. So he says, you have to have that dialectic as an approach because the contradictions exist. And until you have, the thesis and antithesis leading to the synthesis, the change, it's imperative. According to him, this was imperative. So for Marx, there's no inherent social harmony or return to equilibriums like the liberals believe. He doesn't believe that. The second is, of course, the second element of Marxist thought is the materialistic approach to history and the development of productive forces and economic activities, which is central for him for any historical change and operates through class struggle over distribution of the social product. So clearly, he's talking about a materialistic approach to history, which the liberals are also talking about in a different way and how it's perceived. And but the outcome of that materialistic approach to history, along with the methodology of the dialectical approach, is basically the last of what I've written here, the socialist society, which is both necessary and desirable end of historical development, is what he feels. And this was what was there. But the third element of economic laws of motion of modern society, is in terms of a general view of capitalist development and the capitalist mode of production, what Marx speaks about, and its destiny are governed by economic laws of motion of the modern society, according to him. And finally, of course, we have his end, result, which is a socialist society, which to him is necessary, desirable, and it is something which has to be the end of any kind of a historical development. So overall, Marxism characterizes capitalism as the private ownership of means of production and the existence of a wage labor. It says clearly, the belief of Marxists is that capitalism is driven by capitalists who are trying to get profits and capital accumulation in a competitive market economy. So the view of the market economy of the Marxists is very different from the other two. Here again, when he talks about it, labor has been, according to him, has been dispossessed. He says in this notion, the labor is dispossessed and becomes a commodity. So commodification is also something which is being emphasized as leading to the kind of as the implication of political economy and the price mechanism. So so according to Marx, though there is a disproportionality there, but it really needs to be met. And he is, like Keynes, actually speaking about or denying the tendency towards equilibrium, clearly saying that what the liberals are calling equilibrium really doesn't exist. And he argued that the capitalist economies tend to overproduce particular types of goods, because it suits their interest. He also said that there's an inherent contradiction in capitalism between its capacity to produce goods and capacity of the consumers. Who are the consumers? The wage earners. So you have the wage earners to purchase these goods. So the wage earners can only purchase a certain amount. So we are leaving the consumption of certain commodities to only some. We have a hand raised here. Do they want to say now? I'm just going to wind up very quickly. I'm just going to wind up. So we shouldn't have a change in that. So, okay, I'm just going to go on to the next. So when we are looking at the concentration or accumulation of capital, this is something which is, according to Marx, a law which is propelling the development of the capitalist system. And the motive of capitalism is drive for profits, which of course he's critiquing in a major way, and the consequent necessity for the individual capitalist to accumulate. So although individual capitalism is rational, he says, as the liberals assume, the capitalist system itself is irrational. So that's a critique that is brought in. And secondly, the competitive market necessitates that the individual capitalist must save, must invest, and must accumulate. And the individual capitalist can only do that if the other surplus value is not shared in a way that the liberals might, shared in a way that the Marxists might want, in the way that the liberals do, which is uneven completely. And that was the whole problematic that Marxists were talking about. And that if you're sharing that, you have a falling rate of profit. So what is the kind of development you're talking about? The critique of the system that is being propagated is within the system that is being propagated in a major way. It is something which falls in the same category of how it is being perceived. So the core of the Marxist critique of capitalism is that, the fact that the inherent contradiction of capitalism with capital accumulation, and capital accumulation is, in capitalism, you have to have capital accumulation. This capital accumulation sows the seeds of its own destruction and is replaced by, according to Marx, a socialist economic system. Now, we know that this has not happened thus far, and it hasn't happened because of reasons of other implications within it, despite other Marxists, speaking about, and this is interesting because you had Lenin's internationalization of the Marxist theory, which was a kind of a reformulation of it when Lenin spoke about liberalism, spoke about imperialism as the highest form of capitalism. And because it was written in late 1930s, 1939, in fact, imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, the backdrop was the World War in 1917. And it is drawing heavily on Marxist writings. And it's also like a polemic against the ideological enemies and like a synthesis of Marxist critiques of capitalism when it's speaking about it. So in a sense, when we are looking at it today, there are all kinds of issues and concerns which say Lenin's argument, the essence of Lenin's argument of a capitalist international economy does develop the world, but does not develop it evenly. So he agrees. He says, yes, what the liberals are saying, that the capitalist international economy that has been created would develop the world, but it would be such uneven development that it would have its own problems within it. And individual capitalist economies will grow at different rates, and this differential growth of the national power is ultimately responsible for imperialism. So he even brings it. And when we interpret Lenin in today's time, we could be speaking about a neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism and a neo-imperialism today, with economic liberalization, with the international financial institutions at play, or with the kind of systems that we are looking at. And in fact, Lenin, and I want to say, has added a fourth law to the original three Marxist laws of capitalism. And the law of capital, and which he says is, the law says that capitalist economies mature as capital accumulates and as profits fall, and the capitalist economies are compelled to seize colonies and create dependencies to serve as markets, investment outlets, sources of food, and raw materials. So he's trying to say, if imperialism is the highest form of capitalism, it's within the capitalist framework. To survive, it will have to create systems like that. So it has within it seeds of destruction, or should be there, unless we are talking about economies which would mean a change. So overall, Lenin argued that the inherent contradiction of capitalism is that it develops the world and plants the political seeds of its own destruction. It creates foreign competitors with lower wages, standard of living which can outcompete the previously dominant economies on the battlefield of, the world market, if you like. In some senses, this is also, coming true. It's a truism today when we look at the situation and the way it's, coming up. So the critique is of all the perspectives is within that, within the theory itself. So whereas Marxists believe that the state is ultimately the servant of the dominant economic class, realists and the nationalists see the state as relatively autonomous, that there's an autonomy, that the state has relative autonomy, that the state has pursuing national interest that cannot be reduced to the particular interests of any class. So class is a dominant factor here. State is the dominant factor for the economic nationalist, and politics is the dominant factor for the liberals to bring in. So, overall, when we look at the change, and let me just, because we're running out of time, the kind of conclusive propositions that we need to draw on is that the modern states are today global and territorially distributed according to the economic activity. And they're not uniform, they're not homogeneous. It's not being, nothing is being achieved, in a way that is equalizing, because equalizing is not the idea at all. So the modern states have global and territorial distribution and have conflicting national ambitions. And the fundamental question here is of who to produce what, who should be producing what, and where. So the international distribution of labor in that sense of the term, or the fact of, today if you don't buy from Russia, other countries will be in a soup, is because of this kind of a situation of the global division that we've done in a lot of ways, which has meant a change in how the world operates. And we can't turn that back, because even in terms of, say, industrialization or agriculture, in whatever way that we are looking at, we can't change that or turn that back, because it is irreversible. And liberalization itself is irreversible. So it doesn't really, it doesn't bring about that change at all. Secondly, when we are looking at it, and we're looking at free market, the international division of labor is a product of the national policies, because it becomes a part of the public policy of how you're going to, the decisions come from the state. So even though the state might be marginalized because the market has come into being, these are national policies which would, determine what kind of policies that we want to bring in place. So the international division of labor itself is a product of these national policies. And the relative efficiency of this is again questionable. The states can ignore markets as they try to influence the location of economic activities, but if they do that, they have to do it. It entails certain costs, economic costs, which are significant. I mean, how do you produce? Where do you produce if you're not doing it according to the system that has been developed? What are the price mechanisms in place? How will that operate? Becomes very significant too. So we are looking at a kind of a system where it's very pervasive, it is irreversible. Technology has brought in a whole lot of other dimensions to it. So, and then privatization, that is something we cannot ignore. It's a very, very significant aspect of how the nation states are today, functioning. And privatization was justified as an end initially, but must be seen also as a means to achieve the objectives, including a more cost-effective procurement of, say, infrastructure or services to the citizens. But it's questionable whether it has really happened in that sense of the term. And when we speak about privatization in this way, we're also talking about the triad here of the civil society as the new actor in this changing relationship between the state and the market. It's something which, in this triangular, civil society basically has the role of bringing checks and balances as another actor in bringing development. And this perception is probably being brought out by the Marxists more than others. Each of them are speaking about each of these, but from a different perspective. But having said that, ideology is not what defines realpolitik in a lot of ways. So we really need to look at it from beyond that. For the state, it helps, the civil society helps in realizing the acts and the processes of the state and the market better for the society itself. But it cannot be the ones who's supervising this work in whatever way that you have. So there's another hand of the state which would be brought in, which makes, so the relationship has become closer, yet dynamic in a lot of ways, yet challenging each of these, that it is not so simple as to ignoring the markets. The states can't do it. And then, due to the uneven growth of the national economies, the inherent stability of the international market of the capitalist system is problematic. You can see the situation today. It's practically being treated like a third world war, and that you have in place. And having said that, that whole notion of understanding that this international market division of the markets has meant this proximity, and the proximity itself could be counterproductive, and is showing that the elements of being counterproductive. The only relief that each of these perspectives actually could probably aspire for is civil society democratization, democracy being a part of that, and a kind of a mixed economy. So whether it's a socialist or a capitalist, today, I don't think there's any socialist nation in that sense of the term, because the state, the role of the state is dynamic. The role of the administration within that is dynamic. And those are the changes that, we are perceiving in the way the systems are working. The global system is working or not working, if you want to look at it from that perspective. I'm going to stop at this so that we kind of have some comments and questions, and I'm sure you have the answers yourself as well, so we're just going to.
Okay. Thank you, Professor James, who has delivered such a solid and informative presentation.